The night Annalise came into the world, 3 women stood in a cabin that smelled of sweat, blood, and pine smoke. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Outside, cicadas sang their fever song. And somewhere in the distance, a dog howled low and mournful. Martha, the eldest midwife, had delivered more babies than she could count. Strong boys, sickly girls, stillborns wrapped in cloth and buried without names. But she had never delivered a child like this. The mother was barely 16. Her name was Celie, a field hand with skin the color of wet soil and hands that had known only cotton and pain. She lay on a pallet of straw, her body trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The labor had been long and cruel, stretching through the afternoon and into the darkness. The other women, Esther and Ruth, wiped her forehead with damp rags and whispered prayers that felt hollow in the oppressive heat. When the baby finally came, it did not cry. Martha caught the tiny, slick body in her calloused hands and froze. The child's eyes were open, wide, staring, and blue. Not the milky blue of newborns, not the pale grey that sometimes faded into brown. This was the deep, crystalline blue of a summer sky, the same shade that belonged to the master's family, the same eyes that looked down from the portrait hanging in the big house, the same eyes that had no business being in this cabin, on this child, born of a slave girl, and a secret that everyone knew but no one would name. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Esther gasped and stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. Ruth made a small sound, something between a sob and a prayer. Martha said nothing. She wrapped the baby in a rough cotton cloth and placed her in Celie's arms. The girl looked down at her daughter, and tears streamed silently down her face. Not tears of joy, tears of knowing. The master's son had visited the quarters 3 times that spring. Everyone had seen him. No one had stopped him. And now here was the proof, wailing softly in the dim light of a single lantern. But the child did not wail for long. She quieted almost immediately, her blue eyes fixed on her mother's face with an intensity that made Martha's skin prickle. They named her Annalise, though the name was spoken only once, by Celie, in a voice so quiet it was almost a breath. After that, the child became the girl or her or nothing at all. Within a week Celie was gone, sent north, they said, for her health, for her own good. The truth was simpler and crueler. She had been sold to a trader heading to Maryland, sold to erase the evidence, sold to make room for the lie that would replace her. Annalise was left behind, hidden in the quarters like a secret too dangerous to speak. She was raised by Martha, who took her in not out of love but out of duty. The child was strange from the beginning. She did not cry like other babies. She did not laugh or babble or reach for things the way children do. She watched, always watching, with those impossible blue eyes that seemed to see through walls, through lies, through skin. By the time she was 2, the animals had begun to notice her. The chickens would scatter when she approached. The dogs would whine and slink away, their tails tucked low. The horses in the stable would stamp and snort, their ears pinned back, their eyes rolling white. Even the crows, usually bold and raucous, would fall silent when she passed beneath the trees, as if the world itself held its breath in her presence. The other children avoided her. They did not play with her, did not speak to her, did not even look at her if they could help it. It was not cruelty exactly. It was instinct. Something in them recognized that she was different, that she carried something inside her that did not belong. The adults were no better. They would cross themselves when they saw her, murmur prayers under their breath, touch iron or salt or whatever charm they thought might protect them. The overseer, a man named Thaddeus Crenshaw, refused to go near her. Crenshaw was a hard man, a man who had whipped grown men until they bled, who had chased runaways with dogs and dragged them back in chains. But when Annalise looked at him, he would turn away, his jaw tight, his hands trembling. Once, when she was 4, he had tried to strike Martha for some imagined offense, and Annalise had stepped between them. She had not said a word, had not moved, had only looked at him. And Crenshaw had lowered his hand, his face pale, and walked away without a sound. The big house pretended she did not exist. The master, a man named Garrett Ashford, never acknowledged her. His wife, a frail woman with a taste for laudanum and silence, never spoke of her. The plantation ran as it always had, with its cotton and its cruelty, its wealth built on broken backs and broken spirits. But everyone knew, everyone felt it. The child was a crack in the foundation, a flaw in the design, a reminder that some sins could not be buried. When Annalise was 5, she began to speak, not in the broken, childish way of other children, but in full sentences, clear and precise. She did not ask questions, she made statements. She told Martha when the rain would come, and it did. She told Ruth that her son would fall from the barn loft, and 2 days later he did. She told Esther that the master's wife would take to her bed and not rise again, and within a month the woman was dead. No one had taught her to read, but she could. She would sit in the dirt outside the cabins, tracing letters in the dust with a stick, sounding out words from scraps of newspaper or old almanacs that found their way into the quarters. She read the Bible, though no one had given it to her. She read contracts, ledgers, anything she could find. And when she read, her eyes would move quickly, hungrily, as if she were consuming something more than words. Martha watched the child with a mixture of awe and dread. There were nights when she would wake to find Annalise standing at the window, her small form silhouetted against the moonlight, her lips moving soundlessly, as if speaking to someone only she could see. There were mornings when Martha would discover strange patterns drawn in the dirt around the cabin, symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no language she recognized. And there were moments, brief and unsettling, when Martha would look at the girl and feel certain that something ancient looked back at her through those blue eyes. The preacher came when she was 6. He was a traveling man, a Baptist with a booming voice and a conviction that salvation could be won through water and prayer. He had heard the whispers about the girl, and he insisted on baptizing her. Martha tried to refuse, but the preacher was insistent, and the master, eager to be rid of the stain, agreed. They took her to the creek on a Sunday morning, the sky grey and heavy with the promise of rain. The preacher waded into the water, his black coat billowing around him, and beckoned Annalise forward. She went without hesitation, her bare feet silent on the smooth stones. The other slaves stood on the bank, watching, their faces unreadable. The preacher placed his hand on her head and began to pray. His voice rose, fervent and commanding, calling on the Lord to cleanse this child, to wash away whatever darkness clung to her. He pushed her down into the water, holding her under for a long moment. When he pulled her up, gasping and dripping, the water around her had turned black, not muddy, not silted. Black, like ink, like oil, like something alive. The preacher staggered back, his eyes wide, his mouth working soundlessly. Annalise stood in the creek, her blue eyes fixed on him, and said, "You cannot wash away what I am." He left that afternoon and never returned. The story spread quickly, carried by whispers and sidelong glances, and within days the entire plantation knew. The girl was cursed, the girl was unholy, the girl was something no one could name. Doctors came after that, men in fine coats with leather bags full of instruments and theories. They examined her, measured her, tested her. One physician, a man from Savannah with spectacles and a notebook, wrote that she possessed a nervous perception beyond human sense. He claimed she could hear heartbeats from across a room, could sense when someone was lying, could predict events with uncanny accuracy. He spent 3 days at the plantation, conducting experiments, asking questions, taking copious notes. On the morning of the fourth day, he gathered his things and prepared to leave. Martha found him in the yard, loading his bags into his carriage. His hands were shaking. "What did you find?" she asked. The doctor looked at her, his face ashen. "I found," he said slowly, "that there are things in this world that science cannot explain, and perhaps should not try to." What did she do? He climbed into his carriage and took up the reins. "She looked at me," he said quietly, "and told me about my daughter. The one I lost 15 years ago, the one no one knows about. She described her perfectly, down to the color of her dress the day she died." He snapped the reins, and the horse lurched forward. "She should not know that. No one should know that." Another doctor came a month later, older and more skeptical. He was a man of rigid science, dismissive of superstition and folklore. He examined Annalise with clinical detachment, testing her reflexes, her vision, her cognitive abilities. He asked her to read passages, to solve mathematical problems, to identify objects by touch alone. She complied with every request, her expression neutral, her voice soft. On the second day, the doctor set up a more elaborate test. He had heard that the girl could predict future events, and he wanted to test this claim under controlled conditions. He prepared a series of sealed envelopes, each containing a simple question about future occurrences. He asked Annalise to answer the questions without opening the envelopes. She looked at each envelope in turn, her small fingers tracing the edges, and spoke. "The barn will catch fire on Thursday. No one will die, but 3 horses will be lost. Your wife will receive a letter from her sister on Saturday. It will contain news of a death. You will drop your pocket watch on Monday morning. The glass will crack, but the mechanism will still work. And you—" She looked up at him, her blue eyes steady. "You will leave here tomorrow and never speak of what you have seen." The doctor laughed, though the sound was hollow. Preposterous. But Thursday came, and the barn caught fire. 3 horses died. Saturday brought a letter to the doctor's wife. Her sister's husband had passed suddenly. Monday morning, the doctor's pocket watch slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. The mechanism continued to tick. He packed his bags that afternoon. Martha found his notes later, half burned in the fireplace of his room. Only 1 page remained partially intact. The last line, written in a shaking hand, read, "She knows what I have done. God help me, she knows." The master forbade anyone to speak her name after that. Annalise became the child or that girl or nothing at all, but the house could not silence her. Clocks stopped when she entered a room. Paintings would crack, their canvases splitting down the middle, mirrors fogged over, candles guttered and died, no matter how still the air. Children in the big house began to have nightmares, waking in the night screaming about a girl with blue eyes calling to them from the bottom of the well. The slaves feared her, but they also protected her. She was one of them, after all, even if she was something more. They kept her hidden, kept her fed, kept her alive. And in return, she began to do things, small things. She would whisper to Ruth where her lost earring was hidden. She would tell Esther which herbs would cure her aching joints. She would warn Martha when Crenshaw was coming, giving them time to hide whatever needed hiding. But as she grew older, the fear grew too. By the time she was 8, people crossed themselves when they saw her. They avoided her gaze. They spoke in hushed voices when she was near. The air around her seemed to shimmer sometimes, as if reality itself was uncertain in her presence. Objects would move when she was angry. Small things at first, a cup sliding across a table, a door swinging shut, but then larger things. A chair that flew across a room, a window that exploded outward, sending glass into the yard. Martha knew it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened. The child's power was growing, expanding beyond her ability to control it. Or perhaps, Martha thought, Annalise was learning to control it all too well. Either way, the plantation was a powder keg, and the girl was the spark. One night, Martha sat with Annalise outside the cabin. The girl was quiet, her eyes fixed on the stars. "Do you know what you are?" Martha asked softly. Annalise was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I am what happens when something wrong tries to become something right. I am the question that has no answer. I am what they made me." "And what's that?" The girl turned to look at her, and in the moonlight, her eyes seemed to glow, inevitable. The next morning, Annalise was gone. Martha woke before dawn, as she always did, her body trained by decades of labor to rise with the first pale light. The air was cool, heavy with dew, and the world was silent except for the distant crowing of a rooster. She moved through the dim cabin, stirring the embers in the hearth, preparing for another day. It was only when she turned to wake Annalise that she realized the girl's pallet was empty. The blanket was folded neatly, as if she had never slept there at all. Martha's heart clenched. She stepped outside, calling the girl's name softly, then louder, her voice edged with panic. Other slaves emerged from their cabins, rubbing sleep from their eyes, their faces tight with worry. They searched the quarters, the barn, the fields. They looked in the smokehouse, the root cellar, the places children liked to hide, but there was no sign of her. It was Ruth who found the footprints, small, bare feet pressed into the soft earth near the riverbank, leading down to the water's edge. But these were not ordinary footprints. They glowed faintly in the morning mist, a pale luminescence that made Ruth's breath catch in her throat. She called the others, and they came running, their faces pale. The footprints led to the river, then stopped. Beyond them the water was dark and still, giving nothing away. Some said she had drowned, others said she had run. But no one truly believed either. Annalise was not the kind of child who drowned by accident, and she was not the kind who ran without purpose. She had simply vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. The slaves searched for days, combing the riverbanks, the forests, the swamps. They found nothing, no body, no trace. Only those glowing footprints, which faded slowly over the following days, like dying embers. The master was told, of course. He nodded, his face impassive, and ordered the search to continue. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of relief, as if a burden had been lifted. He did not mourn. He did not grieve. He simply returned to his study, to his ledgers and his whiskey, and tried to forget. But forgetting was not so easy. The house felt different after Annalise was gone. The air was lighter, yes, but also emptier, as if something essential had been removed. The clocks began to work again. The paintings stayed whole. The candles burned steadily. And yet, the servants found themselves looking over their shoulders, half expecting to see her standing in the doorway, her blue eyes watching. Martha could not shake the feeling that the girl was still there. Not physically, perhaps, but present in some other way. She would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing. She would hear soft footsteps at night, the sound of a child walking through the quarters, but when she investigated, the paths were empty. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would hear humming. A child's voice, wordless and haunting, drifting through the air like smoke. A week passed, then another. Life on the plantation settled back into its familiar rhythm of labor and pain. The slaves worked the fields, bent under the sun, their hands bleeding from cotton bowls. The master drank his whiskey and counted his profits. The world turned as it always had, indifferent and cruel. And then, one morning, Garrett Ashford was found dead. It was his valet, a man named Benjamin, who discovered him. The master had not come down for breakfast, which was unusual but not unheard of. Benjamin climbed the stairs to the study, knocked softly, and receiving no answer, pushed the door open. Garrett Ashford sat at his desk, his body slumped forward, his hands resting on the polished wood. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, wide, unblinking, and blue. Not the grey-green they had been in life, but the same impossible crystalline blue as Annalise's. Benjamin stumbled back, his hand over his mouth, and ran for help. The doctor was summoned along with the sheriff, a portly man named Horace Dill, who had known Ashford for 20 years. They examined the body, searching for signs of violence, poison, or disease. There were none. The master's heart had simply stopped, they concluded. A natural death, if a sudden one. But neither the doctor nor the sheriff could explain the eyes, that strange, unnatural blue that lingered even in death, as if something had been left behind. The funeral was held 3 days later. It rained, a cold, relentless downpour that turned the churchyard into a sea of mud. The slaves stood at a distance, their heads bowed, their faces unreadable. The master's family, distant cousins and an aging uncle, spoke in hushed tones about the estate, about debts and inheritances, about what would happen next. No one mentioned the girl, no one dared. But that night, as the rain continued to fall, Ruth woke to the sound of singing. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable, a child's voice, high and clear, singing a hymn in a language Ruth did not recognize. She sat up, her heart pounding, and listened. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind, woven into the rain. She was not the only one who heard it. Others in the quarters woke too, their faces pale, their hands trembling. They gathered outside, standing in the mud, listening to the song that seemed to emanate from the very air. It went on for hours, rising and falling, a melody both beautiful and terrible. And when it finally stopped, just before dawn, the rain ceased as well, leaving the world silent and dripping. Martha stood in the doorway of her cabin, her arms wrapped around herself, and whispered, "She's still here." The others did not ask what she meant. They knew. Annalise had not drowned. She had not run. She had become something else, something that no longer needed a body, no longer needed to be seen. She was in the river, in the trees, in the wind. She was everywhere and nowhere, watching, waiting, remembering. The days following the master's death were strange and unsettling. The plantation operated in a kind of limbo, waiting for the new master to arrive and claim his inheritance. The overseer, Thaddeus Crenshaw, took charge in the interim, his cruelty amplified by the absence of oversight. He drove the workers harder, punished infractions more severely, as if trying to assert his authority through violence. But Crenshaw was afraid. Everyone could see it. He carried a pistol now, even in daylight. He flinched at sudden sounds. He avoided certain parts of the plantation, the river bank where the footprints had been found, the master's old study, the well in the center of the quarters. And at night, he drank himself into a stupor, muttering prayers and curses in equal measure. One evening, as dusk settled over the land, Crenshaw was making his rounds through the quarters. He was drunk, swaying slightly, his eyes red and unfocused. He stopped in front of Martha's cabin and pounded on the door. "Where is she?" he shouted. "Where's the demon child?" Martha opened the door slowly, her face calm. "She's gone." "Liar!" Crenshaw grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "She's here. I can feel her. I know she's watching. Let go of me. Tell me where she is." And then the temperature dropped. Not gradually, but instantly, as if winter had descended in a single breath. Crenshaw's grip loosened, his breath misted in the sudden cold. Around them, the other slaves stepped back, their eyes wide. And from somewhere close, impossibly close, came a voice. "I am here." Crenshaw spun, his hand going to his pistol, but there was no one, just the empty path, the darkening sky, the shadows lengthening across the ground. "Show yourself," he screamed. "You want to see me?" The voice was soft, almost gentle. "Are you certain?" And then she appeared. Not solid, not quite real, but there nonetheless. A shape in the gathering darkness, a child's form outlined in pale light. Her eyes were the only thing truly visible, those blue, burning eyes that seemed to contain all the sorrow and rage of the world. Crenshaw raised his pistol, his hand shaking violently. Stay back, demon!" "I am not the demon here," Annalise said quietly. And then she began to speak, her voice growing stronger, more resonant. She spoke of every cruelty Crenshaw had committed, every whipping, every family torn apart, every life destroyed. She named names, dates, specific acts of violence that no one but Crenshaw himself could know. And with each word, the overseer seemed to shrink, to crumble, until he was on his knees in the dirt, the pistol fallen from his hand, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he whispered, "please, I was just, you were just following orders," Annalise finished. "Yes, that is what they all say, but the orders do not absolve the hand that wields the whip. What do you want?" "I want you to remember every face, every scream, every moment of pain you caused. I want you to carry it with you, waking and sleeping, until it crushes you." The apparition faded, dissolving into the night. Crenshaw remained on his knees, sobbing, his mind fractured by the weight of his own guilt. The slaves watched in silence, and no one moved to help him. Martha looked down at the broken man and felt no pity. Only a grim satisfaction that at last someone was being held accountable. The next morning, Crenshaw was found wandering the fields, speaking nonsense, his eyes vacant. The doctor declared him insane, and he was sent away to an asylum in Milledgeville. He would spend the rest of his life there, trapped in memories he could not escape, haunted by a child's blue eyes that followed him even into sleep. And the slaves, gathering in the quarters that evening, spoke in whispers of justice. Not the justice of courts or laws, but something older, something deeper, the justice of the wronged, rising from the earth to claim what was owed. Martha sat outside her cabin, smoking her pipe, and looked toward the river. "Rest now, child," she murmured. "Rest now." But she knew in her bones that Annalise would not rest. Not yet. Not until every debt was paid. The new master arrived on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, when the air had begun to cool, and the leaves were just starting to turn. His name was Richard Ashford, nephew to the late Garrett, and he came from Charleston with his wife Constance and a determination to restore the plantation to profitability. Richard was younger than his uncle, perhaps 35, with sharp features and sharper eyes. He moved through the world with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, never faced consequences, never questioned his right to own other human beings. Constance was different. She was thin and pale, with nervous hands that fluttered like trapped birds. She wore her religion openly, carrying a worn Bible and speaking frequently of providence and God's will. She was, Martha observed from a distance, the kind of woman who used piety as armor against the uncomfortable truths of her existence. She did not want to see the suffering around her, so she cloaked it in scripture and called it divine order. Richard wasted no time asserting his authority. He hired a new overseer, a man named Silas Webb, who made Crenshaw look merciful by comparison. Webb was methodical in his cruelty, approaching punishment with the cold efficiency of a craftsman. He kept detailed records of infractions, real or imagined, and meted out consequences with calculated precision. Under his management, the plantation ran more smoothly, produced more cotton, generated more profit, and the slaves suffered more deeply than they had in years. But something had changed on the land itself. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in strange places, buried in the cotton fields, hanging from tree branches, floating in the horse trough. Livestock grew restless, refusing to graze in certain areas, their eyes rolling white with fear. Workers in the fields would stop mid-task, their faces distant, as if listening to a voice only they could hear. The house began to show signs of disturbance as well. Servants reported cold spots in certain rooms, places where the temperature would drop suddenly and without explanation. Doors would open and close by themselves, their hinges creaking in empty hallways. The smell of river water would appear without source, permeating rooms that were nowhere near any body of water. And at night there were sounds, footsteps on the stairs, a child's laughter, the soft humming that Martha had heard in the quarters. Constance was the first to truly notice. She complained to Richard of nightmares, of a child's voice calling to her from the well, of blue eyes watching her from dark corners. Richard dismissed her concerns as nerves, as the adjustment to a new home, as female hysteria. But Constance knew what she knew. She had been raised to believe in the spiritual world, in angels and demons, in the battle between good and evil, and she was certain that something evil had taken root in this place. Martha watched these developments with a mixture of apprehension and dark satisfaction. Annalise was keeping her promise. She was holding people accountable, forcing them to see what they had chosen to ignore. But Martha also worried about where this would lead, about how far the girl's rage would carry her. Because, make no mistake, it was rage now. Whatever Annalise had been in life, whatever gentleness or curiosity had existed in that strange child, had been burned away. What remained was judgment, pure and uncompromising. The slaves began to experience visitations, not frightening ones mostly. They would wake in the night to find small gifts, a piece of fruit, a flower, a smooth river stone, placed carefully on their pallets. They would hear words of encouragement whispered in the darkness, reminding them of their worth, their humanity, their right to freedom. And when they were sick or injured, they would sometimes feel a cool hand on their foreheads, soothing their pain, speeding their healing. Ruth's grandson, a boy of 7 named Samuel, claimed he saw Annalise clearly. He said she came to him one night, glowing softly in the darkness, and told him stories. Not frightening stories, but tales of places far away, of cities where black people walked free, of schools where children learned to read without fear, of a future that seemed impossible, but that she promised would come. Samuel spoke of these visions with such clarity and detail that even the skeptics found themselves half believing. But the manifestations in the big house grew darker. Constance's nightmares intensified. She would wake screaming, claiming that the girl stood at the foot of her bed, staring with those terrible blue eyes, speaking truths that Constance did not want to hear. The servants found her one morning collapsed in the hallway, her nightgown soaked with sweat, babbling about judgment and damnation and the sins of fathers visited upon children. Richard remained stubbornly rational. He was a man of the modern age, educated in Charleston, exposed to the latest scientific thinking. He did not believe in ghosts or curses or supernatural phenomena. There were, he insisted, logical explanations for everything: faulty construction causing the doors to swing, underground streams creating cold spots, his wife's delicate nerves causing her to imagine things. He refused to acknowledge what everyone else could feel, that the plantation was changing, that something was waking up, that a reckoning was approaching. One evening in late October, as the first frost touched the ground, a traveling preacher arrived at the plantation. His name was Josiah Crane, and he was a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and eyes that burned with fevered conviction. He had heard stories, he said, stories of a cursed plantation, of a child who defied God's law, of a house haunted by sin. Richard dismissed him at first, but Constance begged her husband to let the man stay, to let him cleanse the house, to drive out whatever darkness lingered. Richard agreed, if only to quiet his wife. That Sunday, Crane held a service in the clearing near the quarters. He preached about demons and damnation, about the wages of sin and the power of righteous prayer. His voice rose and fell in rhythmic cadence, his hands gesturing wildly. The slaves attended because they were forced to, standing in the cold, their faces blank, their thoughts elsewhere. Martha watched from the back, her arms crossed, her expression skeptical. She had seen preachers before, men who claimed to speak for God while ignoring the suffering all around them. Crane was no different. He ranted about evil spirits and unclean souls, about children born in sin who carried curses in their blood. And Martha knew with cold certainty that he was talking about Annalise. When the service ended, Crane approached Martha. "I have heard of the child," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The one with the devil's eyes." Martha said nothing. "She must be found," Crane continued. "She must be dealt with before her corruption spreads further." Martha met his gaze, her own eyes hard. "She's gone." "Gone where?" "Wherever she needs to be." Crane's jaw tightened. "You protect a demon." "I protect a child," Martha said flatly. "Something you men never did." That night, Crane insisted on spending hours in the master's old study, praying and anointing the walls with oil. Richard allowed it, more to appease Constance than out of any belief in the ritual. The preacher lit candles, read scripture, and called upon the Lord to cast out any evil presence. He moved through the room with ritualistic precision, marking doorways with oil, reciting verses in Latin and English, his voice growing hoarse with the effort. At midnight, the candles went out, all of them, simultaneously. The room plunged into darkness, and Crane felt the temperature drop, his breath misting in the sudden cold. He fumbled for matches, his hands shaking, but before he could strike one, he heard it. A voice, small, clear, unmistakably a child's. "You do not belong here." Crane spun, his heart hammering. "Who speaks? You know who I am." "Show yourself, demon." Silence. Then slowly, impossibly, the darkness shifted. Not light exactly, but a presence, a shape that seemed to gather the shadows to itself. And then, for just a moment, Crane saw them. Blue eyes, staring at him from across the room. Not angry, not vengeful, just knowing. "You preach about sin," the voice continued, soft and terrible. "But you carry it like a cloak. I see what you have done. To the girl in Savannah, to the boy in Charleston, to all the ones you said you were saving." "Lies!" Crane shouted, stumbling backward. "I serve the Lord." "The Lord sees what I see." The voice was closer now, though the form had not moved. "You took children into your care and used them. You spoke of salvation while committing damnation. You hid behind scripture while destroying innocence. And you dare to come here and speak of demons. No, I know your heart, Josiah Crane. I know every dark corner, every hidden sin, every moment of betrayal. And I want you to know something." The eyes moved closer, burning in the darkness. Crane pressed himself against the wall, his mind fracturing with terror. "You will never escape what you have done. It will follow you into every church, every sermon, every moment of claimed righteousness. You will see the faces of those children in your congregation. You will hear their voices in your prayers. And when you finally die, alone and unmourned, you will understand that no amount of scripture can wash away what you are." The eyes vanished, the cold lifted, the candles reignited, their flames flickering wildly. Crane stood alone in the study, his face ashen, his body trembling uncontrollably. He stumbled from the room, down the stairs, out into the night. He did not pack his bags. He did not say goodbye. He simply ran, his breath tearing from his lungs, his mind screaming with the weight of his exposed sins. They found him the next morning, collapsed on the road 3 miles from the plantation, babbling incoherently about judgment and blue eyes. He was taken to the asylum in Milledgeville, where he spent the remaining 5 years of his life, in a small cell, rocking back and forth, speaking to children only he could see, begging forgiveness that would never come. Richard was furious. Constance wept, and the slaves, hearing the story from the house servants, smiled grimly to themselves. Annalise had not forgiven. Annalise had not forgotten. And she was still watching, still weighing, still passing judgment on those who thought themselves beyond accountability. Martha stood outside her cabin that night, looking toward the river where the glowing footprints had once led. "Be careful, child," she whispered into the darkness. "Rage is a fire that consumes everything, even the one who carries it." But there was no answer. Only the wind moving through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of river water and the echo of a child's voice singing wordlessly in the night. Winter came early that year, creeping across Georgia like a thief, stripping the trees bare and turning the fields to hard, unyielding earth. The slaves worked through the cold, their hands cracked and bleeding, their breath misting in the frigid air. Richard pushed them harder than Garrett ever had, determined to extract every ounce of profit before spring. He was a man consumed by ambition, by the need to prove himself greater than his uncle, to build an empire on the backs of those he considered property. But the plantation was dying. It was a slow death, imperceptible at first, but undeniable to those who paid attention. Crops failed without explanation. Cotton plants withering in soil that should have been fertile, corn stalks collapsing overnight as if some invisible hand had pressed them down. Livestock sickened and died, their bodies found in the morning with no signs of disease or injury, just an absence of life as if it had been simply removed. Equipment broke constantly, wheels cracking, axles snapping, metal tools developing stress fractures that made them dangerous to use. Workers fell ill with fevers that defied the doctor's remedies. The sicknesses followed no pattern that medical science could trace. Some recovered quickly, others lingered for weeks, their bodies wasting away despite treatment. And a few simply died, their hearts stopping in the night, for no reason the doctor could determine. With each death, Richard grew more frustrated, more desperate, driving the remaining workers harder to compensate for the loss. And through it all, the house grew darker, colder, more oppressive. Constance took to her bed, barely eating, barely speaking. She claimed the house whispered to her at night, that she could hear a child crying from somewhere deep below, from the earth itself. She would wake screaming about drowning, about being pulled into dark water by small hands, about blue eyes watching her from the depths. Richard hired more doctors, brought in specialists from Savannah and Atlanta, but none could find anything physically wrong with her. Hysteria, they said, prescribing the usual remedies: rest, fresh air, reduced stimulation, laudanum for the nerves. But Constance knew better. She had seen the blue eyes in her dreams, felt the weight of that gaze, and she knew she was being judged. More than that, she was being found wanting. She had come to this plantation knowing what it was, what horrors sustained her comfort, and she had chosen to look away. Now something was forcing her to look, to see, to acknowledge what she had accepted. The slaves began to disappear. Not many at first, just one or two. A young man named Samuel vanished one night, his bed empty, his few belongings left behind. Then a woman named Grace. Then an older man named Isaiah. Richard accused them of running, of escaping north, and he sent dogs and men to track them, but no trail was ever found. No torn clothing in the woods, no scent for the dogs to follow, no sightings reported. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, erased from the world like mistakes rubbed from a page. But Martha knew differently. She saw the truth in the way the others looked at her, in the questions they did not ask. The missing slaves had not run, they had been taken. Taken by something that moved in the dark, something that remembered every cruelty, every injustice, every moment of suffering. Taken by Annalise, or by whatever Annalise had become. The disappearances were selective, Martha noticed. Samuel had been Webb's favorite target, the young man most frequently whipped for imagined infractions. Grace had been violated by one of the field supervisors, her complaints ignored and punished. Isaiah had been sold away from his family years ago, his wife and children scattered across 3 different plantations, his grief used as a tool to break his spirit. Each of the missing had suffered in specific personal ways, and each had vanished without a trace. One night, Ruth came to Martha's cabin, her face drawn with a mixture of fear and something else, something that might have been hope. "It's happening again," she whispered. "The singing." Martha rose without a word and followed Ruth outside. The air was bitter cold, the sky clear and filled with stars that seemed too bright, too close. And there, carried on the wind, was the sound, that same high, clear voice, singing in a language that predated words, a melody that resonated in the bones and made the soul ache with recognition. It was sorrow and rage and promise all woven together, a sound that spoke of endings and beginnings, of debts and payments, of justice too long delayed. Others emerged from their cabins, drawn by the sound, their faces pale in the starlight. They stood in silence, listening, and some began to weep without knowing why. The singing went on for hours, weaving through the night like a thread of light in darkness, connecting them all to something larger than themselves, something that refused to be forgotten or denied. And then, just before dawn, it stopped. In the silence that followed, the slaves returned to their cabins, but none of them slept. They lay awake, listening, waiting for whatever would come next, because they all knew now, with absolute certainty, that something was coming. A reckoning, a balancing of scales, an ending that would also be a beginning. It came 3 nights later. Richard had called a meeting in the quarters, demanding to know where the missing slaves had gone. He stood before them, Webb at his side, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. The slaves had cost him money, he shouted. They were his property, and someone would be held accountable for their loss. Someone knows, he bellowed, his words slurring slightly. Someone is hiding them. Someone is helping them run. And if you don't speak, you'll all pay. No one spoke. The slaves stood in silence, their faces carefully blank, their eyes on the ground. Richard's fury mounted. He pointed at random people, threatening punishments, threatening sales, threatening to separate families if someone did not come forward with information. Webb stood silent at his side, his hand resting on the whip at his belt, his eyes cold and watchful. And then the ground shook. It was subtle at first, a tremor that made the lanterns sway and caused a few people to stumble, then stronger. The earth rolled beneath their feet, a deep, grinding rumble that sent people scattering in panic. Richard's eyes widened as he fought to keep his balance. Webb fell to his knees, his hands pressed against the dirt, and from somewhere deep below, from the very bones of the earth, came a sound like laughter. A child's laughter, high and bright and utterly inhuman, echoing up through the soil as if the land itself had found something grimly amusing. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had begun. For a moment everything was still. Then the lanterns exploded all at once, spraying oil and glass across the yard. Darkness fell like a curtain, absolute and suffocating. In that darkness they heard her voice. "You speak of property," Annalise said, her words coming from everywhere and nowhere, filling the space between breaths. "But you are not the owner here. This land remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it, every tear shed, every prayer whispered into the night, and it has made its judgment." "Who's there?" Richard shouted, his voice breaking with fear. "Show yourself." "I am already shown. I am in the soil beneath your feet, in the water you drink, in the air you breathe. I am woven into this place like thread through cloth, and I am not alone." Around them, shapes began to appear in the darkness. Not solid, not quite real, but present nonetheless. Figures made of shadow and starlight, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, standing silent in the night, the faces of the dead, the faces of those who had suffered and died on this land, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, their names forgotten, their lives dismissed as meaningless. They stood watching, their eyes reflecting the faint light of the stars, waiting. "These are your property." Annalise's voice was soft now, almost gentle, but somehow more terrible for it. "These souls you bought and sold and worked to death. They have been patient. They have waited. But waiting has an end." Webb broke first. He scrambled to his feet and ran, stumbling in the darkness, his breath coming in panicked gasps. He made it perhaps 20 yards before he stopped, frozen in place as if held by invisible hands. His mouth opened in a scream that never came, his eyes wide and staring at something only he could see. When they found him the next morning, He was dead, his face locked in an expression of absolute terror. His eyes, like Garrett Ashford's before him, turned that impossible shade of blue. Richard stood paralyzed, his mind unable to process what he was seeing, what he was hearing. The rational man, the educated man, the modern man, all of that crumbled in the face of something his worldview could not contain. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He tried to move, but his legs would not obey. "You cannot run from what you are," Annalise said. "You cannot hide from what you have done. The land knows, the dead know. And now you will know, with every breath you take for the rest of your short life, that judgment has found you wanting." The shapes faded. The darkness lifted slightly, revealing the pale light of early dawn. The slaves remained where they were, their faces solemn, their bodies still, and Richard Ashford stood alone in the center of the quarters, his power revealed as the hollow thing it had always been, a construct of violence and fear that could not stand against truth made manifest. Martha watched from the edge of the gathering, her old eyes seeing clearly what would come next. This was not the end. It was barely the beginning. Annalise had only started to collect what was owed, and the debt was deeper and older than any of them could fully comprehend. The plantation that had been built on suffering was being unmade by it, transformed by it, judged by it, and somewhere in the darkness, somewhere between the river and the trees, a child with blue eyes watched and waited, patient as stone, inexorable as time, holding scales that would not be balanced until every account was settled. Spring arrived reluctantly that year, bringing with it warm rains that fell for days without ceasing, turning the roads to rivers of mud and the fields to marshland. But the renewal that should have come with the season did not touch the plantation. Seeds planted in the ground refused to sprout, or sprouted and then died, their pale shoots wilting as if poisoned. The river ran low and dark, its water tasting of iron and decay, unfit for drinking. And the house, that grand structure that had once been a symbol of wealth and power, began to decay from within. Paint peeled from walls in long strips, revealing wood beneath that looked ancient, rotten, as if centuries had passed in mere months. Floorboards warped and cracked, windows developed spider-webbing fractures without being touched. The smell of damp earth permeated every room, no matter how many fires were lit or how thoroughly the servants scrubbed. Mold grew in impossible places, on mirrors, on metal, on glass, spreading like dark fingers reaching across surfaces. Richard's health failed rapidly. He lost weight, his skin taking on a greyish pallor that made him look decades older. He slept poorly, plagued by dreams he could not remember, but that left him gasping and drenched in sweat. When he did sleep, the servants reported that he spoke in his dreams, carrying on conversations with people who were not there, answering questions no one had asked, pleading in a voice thick with terror. He drank more, spending long hours alone in the study, staring at ledgers that no longer made sense. The numbers seemed to move on the page, rearranging themselves into patterns that looked almost like words, almost like accusations. He would find himself reading passages he had not written, margin notes in his own handwriting that he could not remember making, calculations that added up to impossible totals. Constance was sent away finally, her condition having deteriorated beyond what even the most dismissive doctor could ignore. She went without protest, her eyes empty, her mind elsewhere. When the carriage came for her, she looked back at the house once, and Martha, watching from the quarters, saw recognition in that glance. Constance knew what was happening, knew and could not stop it. She had tried to look away for too long, and now she could see nothing but what she had ignored. Richard told people she was recovering in Savannah, that the country air had been too harsh for her constitution, that she would return when she was stronger, but everyone knew the truth. The house had broken her. The plantation had driven her to madness. She would not be coming back. The slaves, meanwhile, had developed their own rituals. They left offerings at the riverbank: flowers, bits of bread, strips of cloth, small carved figures made from wood or stone. They whispered prayers to Annalise, asking for protection, for mercy, for justice. The offerings were always gone by morning, taken by the river, or taken by something else. No one was quite sure. Some saw her as a guardian, a spirit who punished the wicked and watched over the oppressed. They told stories about her to the children, tales of a girl with eyes that saw through lies, who remembered every wrong and repaid it in kind. Others feared her, believing she had become something monstrous, something that fed on suffering and rage that had grown beyond any human understanding or control. Martha neither prayed nor left offerings. She simply waited, as she had always waited, knowing that whatever was coming would arrive in its own time. She was not afraid. She had raised Annalise, had seen the child's strangeness from the beginning, and she understood, in a way the others did not, that the girl had always been more than human. She had been born of violence and silence, shaped by cruelty and denial, and those forces had transformed her into something the world could not contain. One evening in late April, as the sun set in streaks of red and gold that looked almost like blood in the sky, a stranger arrived at the plantation. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of quiet authority. He introduced himself as Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, a physician and researcher from Boston. He had heard, he said, of the unusual events at the Ashford plantation, and he was interested in documenting them for scientific purposes. Richard, desperate for answers, for some explanation that made sense in the rational world he understood, agreed to let Harrow stay. The doctor set up in one of the guest rooms, filling it with notebooks, scientific instruments, and various curiosities, jars containing preserved specimens, books on mesmerism and animal magnetism, devices for measuring electromagnetic fields and atmospheric pressure. Harrow was methodical in his approach. He interviewed the slaves, though most were reluctant to speak openly. He examined the house, taking measurements of temperature and humidity, noting cold spots and areas where his compass behaved erratically. He collected samples of water from the river, soil from the fields, even scraping material from the walls where mold grew in those strange patterns. He spoke with Richard at length, documenting the timeline of events, the sequence of deaths and disappearances, the physical manifestations that had been reported. Richard was eager to talk, grateful to have someone who approached the situation with scientific skepticism rather than superstitious fear. Harrow listened carefully, taking copious notes, asking precise questions, his face betraying nothing of what he thought. But Harrow was not quite what he appeared to be. He was indeed a physician, indeed a researcher, but his interests ran to phenomena that conventional science dismissed or ignored. He had studied cases of unexplained events across New England and the South, documenting instances of what some called hauntings, others called possession, and he called persistent consciousness manifestation. He had developed theories about how trauma and injustice could imprint themselves on physical locations, about how suffering could generate forces that transcended normal physical laws. And he had heard of children like Annalise before, children born with abilities that seemed to bend the rules of nature, children who existed at the edges of the explicable. He had never documented such a case so thoroughly, never had the opportunity to study the phenomenon in such detail. This plantation represented a unique opportunity for research, and he intended to take full advantage of it. On his third night at the plantation, Harrow conducted a formal experiment. He set up instruments in the master's old study: thermometers, electromagnetic sensors, cameras with slow exposure plates that could capture images over extended periods. He wanted to document evidence of the phenomenon, to capture proof that something genuinely anomalous was occurring. He sat alone in the dark, his notebook open, his pen ready, his mind alert and focused. At midnight the temperature dropped precipitously. Harrow's breath misted in the air, and he noted the temperature reading: 42 degrees Fahrenheit, a drop of nearly 30 degrees in less than a minute. The electromagnetic sensors began to react, their needles swinging wildly, registering fluctuations that made no physical sense. The glass bulbs in his detection devices flickered with pale light, responding to some force he could measure but not explain. And then he heard it. The voice, small, clear, unmistakable. "Why do you seek me?" Harrow's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady, professional. "I want to understand." Understand what? What you are, how you exist, the mechanisms by which consciousness can persist beyond physical death and interact with material reality. A pause. Then, with something that might have been amusement, you use many words to avoid saying ghost. I prefer to describe phenomena accurately rather than relying on superstitious terminology. But that is what I am, is it not? A ghost, a spectre, a revenant, something that should not be but is. I believe, Harrow said carefully, that you are a form of persistent consciousness that has found a way to interface with physical matter through mechanisms we do not yet understand. You are evidence that the relationship between mind and matter is more complex than current scientific models suggest. Another pause, longer this time. You seek to understand me so you can understand death. Harrow's breath caught. It was true, though he had never articulated it quite so directly. Yes, I have lost people, as all people do, and I want to know what lies beyond. I cannot tell you that. I am not beyond. I am here, anchored to this place by anger and purpose. I am not what awaits you after death. I am what happens when death is denied. How did you become what you are? I was made, the voice said softly, made by violence and silence, by a system that treated people as property and children as consequences to be hidden. I was born wrong, born knowing things I should not know, seeing things I should not see. And when I understood what had been done, not just to me, but to everyone here, to all the people whose suffering built this place, I could not let it go. I could not fade. I held on to rage like a rope in the dark, and it kept me here. And now? Now I collect what is owed. Now I balance scales that have been tilted for too long. Now I remind the living that no wrong goes unanswered forever. The instruments sparked, several of them shorting out in rapid succession. Glass cracked, papers scattered across the room as if caught in a wind that did not exist. And then, for just a moment, Harrow saw her. Not clearly, not fully, but a shape in the darkness, a child's form, translucent and flickering like candlelight. And her eyes, those impossible blue eyes, fixed on him with an expression that was neither anger nor sorrow, but something far more complex, a kind of terrible, ancient sadness mixed with implacable determination. "Leave this place," she said, and her voice was gentle now, almost kind. "There is nothing here for you to find except more sorrow. Your wife and daughter are not where I am. They are truly beyond, truly at rest. But if you stay here, if you continue to seek me, you will find only what I have found. That rage is a fire that consumes everything it touches. How do you know about—" "I see," Annalise said simply. "I see everything that has happened in this place. Every moment of joy and suffering, every secret and sin. It is my curse and my purpose, and I see you, Nathaniel Harrow, carrying grief like stones in your pockets, hoping that understanding death will somehow make the loss hurt less. It will not. Knowledge does not heal that kind of wound. Only time and acceptance can do that." The apparition faded, the cold lifted, the remaining instruments settled into stillness. Harrow sat alone in the study, his face wet with tears he had not realized he was shedding, his notebooks filled with observations that suddenly seemed pointless and hollow. He left the next morning, as Annalise had suggested. Before departing, he sought out Martha in the quarters. She was sitting outside her cabin, smoking her pipe, watching the morning sun burn the mist from the fields. "You raised her," Harrow said. It was not a question. "I tried," Martha replied. "But you cannot raise something like that. You can only witness it." "Is she evil?" Martha considered the question. "No. She is justice without mercy. She is truth without compassion. She is what happens when suffering is ignored for so long that it takes on a life of its own." "Evil?" She shook her head. "Evil is what created her. She is merely the response." "Can she be stopped?" "Why would you want to stop her? This place deserves what it is receiving." Harrow had no answer for that. He climbed into his carriage and left, carrying with him notes that he would never publish, observations that would never see scientific scrutiny, knowledge that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had wanted to understand death, and instead he had found something worse. The understanding that some injustices are so profound they tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. And in the quarters, Martha watched him go and thought about the girl she had tried to raise, the strange child with blue eyes who had somehow become the conscience of a plantation, the voice of the voiceless, the reckoning that could not be denied. She wondered, not for the first time, what would happen when Annalise's work was done, when every debt was collected and every account settled. Would she finally rest? Would she fade into whatever peace awaited those who had been denied it in life? Or would she remain eternal and watchful, a reminder carved into the land itself that wrong must always, eventually, be answered? Summer arrived like a fever, bringing with it heat that seemed unnatural, oppressive, the kind of heat that made it hard to breathe and harder to think. The plantation labored under the weight of it, the slaves moving like shadows through fields that yielded nothing, working land that had turned against them as surely as it had turned against those who claimed to own it. Richard Ashford had become a ghost himself, a thin, trembling man who rarely left the house and spoke to no one. His mind, already fractured by events he could not explain, had retreated into itself, building walls of denial that grew higher and more fragile with each passing day. He sat in the study for hours, staring at nothing, his lips moving soundlessly, carrying on conversations with people who were not there. The plantation was effectively being run by the remaining house servants now, who made decisions about daily operations and tried to keep some semblance of order. But they all knew it was temporary, a holding pattern before the inevitable collapse. The land was dying, the buildings were decaying. The entire enterprise was coming apart at the seams, unraveling from within, as if something were pulling loose the threads that held it together. More slaves disappeared, not in dramatic fashion, not with signs of struggle or flight, but simply absent. Their beds empty in the morning, their few possessions left behind, no trace of where they had gone. The remaining workers no longer seemed frightened by these disappearances. If anything, they seemed almost envious. Those who vanished were the ones who had suffered most, who carried the deepest scars, who had earned, if anyone had, the right to escape. Martha knew the truth, though she never spoke it aloud. Annalise was not taking them away. She was showing them the way, opening doors that had always been there but that no one had seen, paths that led north to freedom, to lives beyond this place of suffering. The girl had become more than a spirit of vengeance. She had become a guide, a guardian, a force that both judged and protected, that punished the guilty while offering salvation to the innocent. The house servants reported increasingly disturbing phenomena. Entire rooms had become impossible to enter, their doors refusing to open no matter how much force was applied. The master bedroom, where Richard slept fitfully, was one of these. The servants would hear him calling out in the night, his voice panicked and pleading, but the door would not budge. In the morning he would emerge looking worse, his eyes sunken and dark, his hands shaking, speaking of dreams that were not dreams, of visitations that left him exhausted and terrified. The river had risen despite the lack of rain, its dark water creeping up the banks, threatening to flood the low-lying fields. But this was not normal flooding. The water moved wrong, flowing in directions that defied gravity, pooling in places it should not reach, leaving behind residue that stained everything it touched. Animals refused to go near it. Even the most desperate humans would not drink from it, sensing something fundamentally wrong about the water, something that had nothing to do with pollution or disease, and everything to do with intention. One morning in late June, the house servants found something extraordinary. In every mirror in the house, every reflective surface, the same image had appeared overnight. It was not a reflection of the rooms or the people who looked into them. It was a scene from the past, crystallized and perfect, a young girl standing by a river, her face tilted up toward the sky, her blue eyes wide and aware. Annalise as she had been in life, frozen in a moment of pure existence before everything had gone wrong. But more disturbing than the image itself was what appeared around it in each reflection. Written in what looked like frost or condensation, despite the summer heat, were names. Hundreds of names, thousands perhaps, covering every inch of reflective surface not occupied by the girl's image. The names of everyone who had lived and died as slaves on this plantation, going back generations. Names that had never been recorded in any ledger or official document. Names that existed only in memory and oral tradition, names that had been deliberately forgotten or suppressed. Richard saw it and finally broke completely. He ran from room to room, trying to wipe away the names, smashing mirrors with his fists until his hands bled. But the images remained, reappearing on every reflective surface, on polished metal, on water in basins, on windows, on anything that could catch and hold light. The names would not be erased. The names demanded to be seen, to be remembered, to be acknowledged. That afternoon, Richard ordered the slaves to assemble in front of the house. It was the first time he had emerged in weeks, and the change in him was shocking. He looked ancient, his hair gone completely white, his body bent as if carrying an impossible weight. Webb was dead, the other overseers had fled, and Richard stood alone on the porch, facing people he could no longer control, no longer command, no longer pretend to own. "I want to speak to her," he said, his voice cracking. "I want to speak to the girl. Annalise. I know she is here. I know she is listening." The slaves stood silent, their faces carefully blank. Martha, standing in the front row, felt a cold wind rise despite the summer heat. "I did not make this system," Richard continued, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I inherited it. I was born into it. I did not create slavery, did not invent this hierarchy, did not—" "But you perpetuated it," a voice said, cutting through his excuses like a knife. It was Annalise, though she remained unseen, her words seeming to come from the air itself. "You benefited from it. You defended it. You enforced it. And when you had the opportunity to choose differently, to acknowledge the humanity of those you claimed to own, you chose profit instead. You chose comfort. You chose to continue the sin because ending it would have cost you something." "I am sorry," Richard said, and he was weeping now, tears streaming down his face. "I am sorry for what was done, for what I have done. Your sorrow changes nothing," Annalise said, and her voice was neither angry nor kind, simply factual. "Sorrow without action is meaningless. Regret without restitution is hollow. You cannot apologize your way out of injustice. You can only choose in each moment whether to perpetuate it or to end it. And you have always chosen perpetuation." "What do you want from me?" Richard screamed, his voice breaking. "What can I do? Tell me and I will do it." There was a long silence, then softly, "Free them." Richard staggered backward. "I cannot. The law is wrong. The law is what created me. The law is what keeps people in bondage while claiming to represent justice. You hide behind it like a child behind a mother's skirts, but the law will not protect you from truth. The law will not save you from consequences. Free them. Give them the papers that say they are people, not property." Let them choose their own paths. It is the only thing that might buy you even a moment's peace before you die. Die! Richard's voice was barely a whisper. You are already dying. Your body knows it, even if your mind refuses to accept it. You have perhaps 3 months, perhaps less. You can spend that time clinging to power that no longer exists, or you can spend it trying to make even the smallest amends for a lifetime of wrong. Choose. The voice faded. The cold wind died away. Richard stood trembling on the porch, his face the color of old paper, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. The slaves waited, watching, their expressions unreadable. After a long moment, Richard turned and walked back into the house. The slaves dispersed slowly, returning to their cabins, their work, their lives. No one spoke about what had happened. No one speculated about what would come next. They simply waited, as they had always waited, patient and enduring. That evening, Martha sat outside her cabin and felt Annalise's presence nearby, just beyond the edge of visibility. You gave him a choice, she said quietly to the air. That is more mercy than he deserves. I gave him an opportunity, Annalise's voice responded, soft as wind through leaves. Whether he takes it or not is his own choice, but I wanted him to know that the option existed, that redemption is always possible, even if it is rarely chosen. Most people would rather die defending their right to be wrong than admit they were wrong and change. Will you destroy this place? I do not need to destroy it. It is destroying itself. Injustice always does, eventually. The house is rotting from within. The land is becoming barren. The entire structure is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. I am merely hastening the process. And when it is done, when the plantation is gone and the people are free, what will you do then? There was a long pause. I do not know, Annalise said finally. I exist because I am needed. When I am no longer needed, perhaps I will simply stop. Or perhaps I will remain a memory in the land, a warning to those who come after, a reminder that wrong does not disappear simply because we stop looking at it. 3 weeks later, Richard Ashford did something extraordinary. He summoned a lawyer from Savannah and, in the presence of witnesses, signed papers freeing every slave on the plantation. He gave them the choice to leave or to stay as paid workers, gave them portions of land they could farm for themselves, gave them the legal documentation that transformed them, at least in the eyes of the law, from property into people. It was not complete justice. It could never be complete justice. Centuries of wrong could not be undone with a few signatures, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition, a first step toward making right what had been so terribly wrong. The slaves, former slaves now, reacted with cautious hope. Some left immediately, setting out north toward states where freedom was more than just words on paper. Others stayed, unwilling to leave the only home they had known, unwilling to abandon the graves of their ancestors buried in unmarked plots across the plantation. They would build new lives here, they decided. They would transform this place of suffering into something else, something better. Martha stayed. She was too old to travel, too tired to start over somewhere new. She would see out her days here, in the place where she had raised a strange child who had become something more than human, something necessary and terrible, and ultimately merciful. Richard Ashford died 6 weeks later, quietly in his sleep, his face peaceful for the first time in months. They found him in the morning, his eyes closed, his hands folded on his chest, and when they looked closely, they saw that his eyes, even in death, had faded back to their original color. The blue had left him. He had been released from judgment, or perhaps had simply passed beyond its reach. The plantation slowly emptied after that. The house, already decaying, continued to fall apart, boards rotting, windows breaking, nature reclaiming what had always been hers. Within a year, it was uninhabitable. Within 5 years, it was ruins. And within a generation, it had been reclaimed entirely by the forest, reduced to foundations and fragments, stories and warnings. But people who walked near the old plantation grounds sometimes reported strange things. A child's laughter in the wind, the smell of river water where no water should be, and blue eyes watching from the shadows, patient and eternal, making sure the past was never forgotten, ensuring that the debt once paid would never be owed again. Martha lived to see it all. She died at 93, peacefully in her sleep, and they buried her near the river where the glowing footprints had once led. On the night of her funeral, people reported seeing two figures by the water, an old woman and a young girl, walking together into the mist, their forms fading slowly until nothing remained but the sound of singing, wordless and beautiful, carried on the wind. And the land, at last, was at peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of remembering. Not the peace of silence, but the peace of acknowledgement. The plantation had been built on suffering, and it had been unmade by truth. And Annalise, born of violence and silence, had become something greater than either, a force of justice, a guardian of memory, a reminder that no wrong, however deeply buried, stays hidden forever. Her name was spoken for generations after, whispered to children as both warning and promise, a warning that cruelty has consequences, that injustice creates forces that cannot be controlled, and a promise that the voiceless will find voice, that the forgotten will be remembered, that those who suffer will eventually see their suffering acknowledged and their oppressors held to account. The girl that science could not explain had become the truth that history could not deny. And in the end, that was enough. It had to be enough. Because some stories do not end with resolution, but with understanding, not with answers, but with better questions, not with forgetting, but with a promise to remember always, to carry forward the weight of what was done, so that it might never be done again. In the Deep South, where the past lives in the present like roots beneath the soil, they still tell stories about a plantation that was unmade by the truth it tried to bury. They tell of a girl with impossible blue eyes who would not let silence stand, who demanded that the world see what it had chosen to ignore. They tell of justice that came not from courts or laws, but from something deeper, something older, something that exists in the bones of the land itself. And on certain nights, when the wind moves through the ruins of what once was, when the river runs dark and the moon shines pale, you can still hear her singing. A voice that is both child and chorus, individual and collective, asking the same question that has always needed asking. How long will you look away? How long will you choose comfort over conscience? How long will you pretend that what you do not see does not exist? The answer, Annalise whispers from the darkness, is no longer, not anymore, never again.